So welcome everyone to the very first event of the Global Alumni Week 2021. It is with great pleasure that we welcome today Florence Gillette. Thank you very much, Florence, for being here. So the CEMS Global Alumni Week is a globally organized week of activities that involve all CEMS stakeholders, alumni, students, local CEMS clubs, corporate and social partners, academics. So first of all, we would like to start with some housekeeping rules. Please note that upon your arrival, you will be muted. You will need to unmute yourself if you would like to speak. Please mute yourself if you're not actively speaking. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak or type your question in the chat. We highly welcome you to interact live with Florence, and Florence will welcome questions at the end of her presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Florence Gillette, CEMS alumna from 1992 from HEC, ESADE, and University of Cologne. And she's also the recipient of the 2020 CEMS Senior Alumna of the Year. She began her career in financial positions at Procter & Gamble and then moved to Hallmark as Finance and Administration Director. She eventually transitioned away from a financial career towards a professional endeavor dedicated to the commitment of helping others in need, which has resulted in a very impressive path at the International Committee of the Red Cross for nearly 13 years. Her time at the Red Cross has resulted in her traveling the globe, performing roles in various places such as Ukraine, Sudan, Philippines, Pakistan, and many others, all demonstrating the extent of Florence's commitment towards the betterment of people, no matter the location. Thank you very much, Florence, for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. Dear alumni, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for having joined us for this discussion today. When I followed the CEMS curriculum in the early 90s, CEMS was an alliance of a few universities and business schools who focused mainly on business. Today, it has grown to a very wide network in a world that evolved and in which NGOs and the nonprofit world have increasingly professionalized themselves, hiring managers and leaders from varied backgrounds. A number of you today work in the humanitarian and social sectors or in the sustainable economy. The definition of humanitarianism has also evolved and continues to evolve as humanitarian workers took stock of the hard lessons they learned, and as the world increasingly realized that diversity is a wealth, that people need to be empowered with decision influencing their lives, no matter where they are from, what they believe, and what their level of vulnerability is. Today, I would rather talk of humanitarian actions and humanitarianism, of where it stands today and why the skills required for tomorrow are increasingly complex. My generation was deeply impacted by the Ethiopian and Somalian famines in the 80s. And as teenagers, we often associated humanitarian assistance with Westerners living their comfortable lives to bring food and medicines to starving children. I would be a bit critical and say it could be perceived as a rather colonialist view and as a way to respond to humanitarian needs, and a way that puts at risk the principle of equality amongst all human beings. Increasingly, people affected by conflict, other man-made and natural disasters, raise their voice. And those willing to assist them progressively integrated that a sound and sustainable humanitarian response should be based on the respect of life, dignity, but also agency of the affected populations. In 20 years in the humanitarian sector, I mostly worked on the response to situations of conflict, at times compounded by natural disaster or, as today, by a pandemic. The work of our teams increasingly developed from a direct short-term response to more complex approaches. In immediate and sudden onset situations, needs for food, water, medicine still need to be addressed in a first stage through a direct and very rapid response. The challenges in such situation are those of logistics and access. Rapid deployment of goods involved emergency stocks, solid delivery chain to areas on or beyond front lines, at times without roads, airstrips, or harbors, requiring to use extraordinary means. But it also requires to negotiate with those fighting or controlling an area to have access to the population in a secured manner, thus requiring specific networking and negotiation skills with state authorities and political leaders, as well as with weapon bearers. As crisis situations often last beyond a few days or weeks, and often over years, when not decades, a different approach and response has to be put in place as we are moving into protracted crisis. International humanitarian law, the law that applies in armed conflict, prescribes that it is the responsibility of the parties to the conflict to provide and facilitate the provision for the basic needs of the populations, including for essential services. This means that, as per law, the ultimate responsibility with humanitarian acts is increasingly to better involve the civilians affected by the conflict and the civilian services accompanying them to support them in their endeavors to cover their basic needs. This involves, on one side, a thorough dialogue and collaboration with the civilians to understand the extent of their needs and how they think they can best cover them with agency and dignity. And on another side, thorough dialogue with authorities or those in control to accompany civilians and to create an environment where the civilians can cover their basic needs. Though many have not experienced conflict, though many who have not experienced conflict think that food and water are the primary needs, conflict-affected populations often prioritizes the connections to their family and communities, the right to be able to choose where they go, the need for a more secure environment, and perspective for a future, whether in the form of education for their children, capacity to generate their own income, and primarily independence over food and water. The form of these needs varies a lot and take different shapes depending on the culture of the community they stem from, but also on their individual needs. For instance, in the context where I am now, in Ukraine, as in Georgia, where I worked more than 10 years ago, an essential aspect of life is the way civilians, people respect their ancestors and regularly visit the tombs of their parents and grandparents. Being cut from acts is a major problem for them. Meanwhile, I worked in other contexts where this is not a major need because funeral rites are different and this is not a priority. So it's just to show very, very different culture and how it impacts. Another example at individual level of the difference of needs between people. Still coming back to Ukraine, a large part of the population that has been affected by that is being affected by the conflict in eastern Ukraine today are older persons. Those older persons, they survive very often because every morning they wake up to take care of their animals and of their gardens because it gives them an occupation, but also it's a source of food for them. And they need an accompaniment to do so. Other people would have more needs for education or access to cash to launch a small business, or maybe more news about their loved one who has gone missing during the hostilities. So it's just to say that there is not a single response for a single need, but you really need to look at the diversity of people, of needs, and at their culture and individual specificities and vulnerabilities. The basic skills needed to accompany those people is a capacity to listen, but it's not always easy to listen. And it requires the skills to create the right environment to do so. Plus, it requires the capacity to be able to do a synthesis that is expressed and transformed into a concrete response. This actually goes beyond various marketing tools we all learned about. from the focus group, from the surveys and other tools. This time, the person should be at the center, not the product or the service. To better listen, diversity in the team is also an essential element. Then the challenge is to convince or persuade those in control, authorities or opposition groups, to take their responsibilities and actually prioritize the real needs of the population and find ways to accompany them. This requires a thorough understanding of the decision chains of the legal frameworks and on how influences work in very varied contexts. Indeed, often it is easier for a party to a conflict, for a state or an armed group to deny a response or to have others doing it, such as a humanitarian organization. However, long-term solutions need to come from within. They need to come from the communities. They need to come from those who administer those communities. When there is resistance within the system to either respond or let access for humanitarian actors to support the response to needs until a solution is found, it might be necessary to look at other sources of influence. Mobilization through public media campaign might work in some contexts, but is not always the right choice in conflicts, including in areas where there might be limits to access to media or limits to the freedom of media. Therefore, it is important to work with actors who might influence those in control of those areas, either through positive narrative or sometimes through stronger narratives. This leads to what the IFRC defines as humanitarian diplomacy, aiming at enriching international humanitarian law for a better protection of the civilians and of other categories of people owed protection, such as detained fighters, or aiming at getting states supporting other states or parties to conflict to convince those they support to adapt their behavior and to treat the needs of the affected civilians and other categories with more respect. A number of humanitarian curriculum surfaced in the late 90s up to master's and PhD levels. However, the humanitarian sectors welcomes people from many horizons who bring expertise and skills. Working in this sector primarily requires a deep interest for the human beings, for their differences and commonalities. It requires very sound analytical skills and an ability to envision, or rather an ability to accompany conflict affected population to envision what can be and how to get there, even in the worst situation possible when no hope is in sight. It requires leadership and perseverance. And this not only at the level of higher decision maker, but at the level of each location, each team, each project, each program. It also requires an ability to analyze and manage risks, whether humanitarian, security related, or political. From an internship with Procter & Gamble, where I worked on the country risk more than 30 years ago, to decision-making on which influences state, to take decision on how to influence states to take the right step to enhance the dignity and the agency of conflict-affected populations through assessing risk on responding or not, and how to pockets of severely malnourished population at risk of being attacked. There is a long way and many detours. But a lot of that was made possible thanks to the tools and approaches I initially learned in a CEMS classroom, developed in the private sector and tested in the humanitarian one. I could speak for hours about a job I love in spite of its many challenges. And also, to be honest, I often struggle to be concise after 30 years of professional life. Therefore, I will stop here so that we have enough time to have a real discussion and we can exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florence. That was very good. And I know that you have a lot to talk about, and we can open the floor now for any questions that you have. So pop them in the chat or raise your hand. and then you can speak up and ask your questions to Florence directly. In the meantime, oh, here we have a question. So Anna asked, do you believe that the pandemic has displaced priority response to other critical crises? You're muted still.
Yes, I'm muted. I'm just that's a good question. Yes, the pandemic has decreased the general interest or attention to conflicts. The IFRC, but also the United Nations, have been very careful to remind, the general public, but also the states about the fact that conflicts are still going on, pandemic or not. And actually, conflicts are even made worse, and the response to conflict-induced needs been made more complicated because of the pandemic. One of the fear is clearly that there will be less means, and we can already see that, to respond to victims of conflict or other natural disasters, because a lot of the money that is essential to respond is actually needed by the main donor states for their own response to the COVID crisis. So clearly there is an element which is a concern. We also start to see quite serious concerns in regards to, we saw very serious concerns in regards to access to items essentials to prevent and respond to the pandemic. I don't know if I trust most of you remember how plane loads of masks were being stolen on airports by states from other states. I mean, this is within the European Union. So we entered a world where, scarce resources trigger rather violent behavior. So if states were able to steal from each other within the European Union, which I think they stopped now, but you can imagine how it impacts conflict-affected context even more. But we also now start to be highly worried in regards to the vaccines. As you have seen in many places, in many media, most of the vaccines have gone to only a handful of countries right now, a very few countries. And you have many countries in conflict where vaccines are not coming, and it's not just about vaccines, it's about syringes, it's about all the material you need to inject, it's about the cold chain. And this is not going to those countries, and it will take much longer to go there. And it is a concern, because we are now seeing that, we are hearing about vaccine passport, we are hearing about other things. What will happen to all those, for instance, who are fleeing conflict because there is no other choice, and are our refugees or our migrants, because sometimes the border is quite fine between refugees and migrants, and who are on their way trying to cross borders through very challenging situation, and where they have also no access to protect themselves from a disease that might affect them more, because unfortunately, the overall health status of such population is often weaker than those of people living, with me. So yes, that's a concern.
Yeah, I agree. And then do you see, because many of the local governments in those areas that are in conflict regions, they're not very capable of providing sufficient humanitarian aid. Do you see a role for the bigger INGOs to distribute the vaccines more evenly? Or
it's a good question. The thing is, vaccination in some contexts possibly, in some other contexts it's not. NGOs, UN agencies, Red Cross movement, Red Crescent movement, there are different solutions in different contexts. The problem is, for instance, that at this stage, only the UN have access, and only 2 agencies of the UN have access to COVAX, for instance. COVAX, which is, this global plan to have, to provide more equitable access to vaccines. The first delivery of COVAX vaccine, if I understood well, was yesterday in Ghana. So we are barely starting. And then there is it's not just a matter of, humanitarian actors doing that. I mean, vaccinating a whole country is a challenge for countries like France or Germany or the UK or the US. So you can imagine that, it requires, a lot of efforts in terms of communication, in terms of logistics, in terms of, convincing people to get access. And to seek access to those vaccines, and it has to be a concerted effort. So it's not one actor or another who can do that, but it has to be concerted. And definitely it also requires authorities, or those in charge or in control of areas, to be convinced about that. Because no matter, I mean, some countries in conflict are not failed state. I live in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a failed state. I mean, and there are quite a number of countries who are not failed states. Then you do have countries with, in conflict where, well, there has been a failed state. I mean, Somalia would say the extreme example of a failed state. But you still need to have protocols. You still need to have ratification. I mean, like we're talking about vaccine certificates. I mean, all those things require legal framework. So it cannot be done just by, independent organizations. So yes, there could be a bigger role, but to play that bigger role, there would be a need for funding that it's not yet there.
Yeah, I agree. I also remember, like, in the start of the pandemic, that the European Union and all the overarching international organizations really said that this is a moment to unite and to work together. And it's sad but interesting to see that now the vaccines are rolling out, that people are, starting to focus on their own country and their own response. But yeah, I definitely hope that in the future there will be more united response. Margot asked a question: do you think that social media has had a positive impact on public awareness of humanitarian crisis, or that on the contrary, crises are now lost in the pool of information?
That's a good question. Social media has actually given access to much more information and has put in light needs or situations that were not put in the limelight before. So that plays a big role in that sense. Social media is also quite important because it gives not just to those who are sitting behind their computers, but also those in the field, the population themselves have access to more information. So they also have access to, where they have access to social media, they know more about services that are available to them. They can also provide their feedback much more. In Ukraine, we've got a system of hotline in the IFRC. For instance, I mean, January, February, we had more than 10,000 contacts through those hotlines per month. And a lot of those contacts are actually not through the phone. There are some contacts through the phones, which are still important, and because we also deal with a lot of older persons that might not be that connected to social media. But we also use a lot Facebook, Vcontacte, and other, and other means to reach out that are interactive. And it brought a lot of positive, but it also brings some risks. And I agree that over information sometimes kills the information, so that's a concern. And then you also have sometimes overreaction, on certain developments that triggers themselves, more instability. So I think it's a positive development. It just has to be managed well. And one of the specific concerns with social media is also the protection of data, of personal data, which is something on which we've been working on, and we're working on handbooks and tools for data protection, but also on legal frameworks, because there is more exposure of the people due to the social media. and it's particularly an issue in conflicts, also in situations where they could be either persecuted or traced back based on their use of social media. So it actually also has a direct protection issue for the individuals. But it also brought a lot of positive development. So it's a matter of framing, having the right legal framework to protect, and also ensuring equitable access to social media, because this is a concern. In many conflict situations, you have no 3G. Well, I'm not even mentioning other type of internet, but you also need to be equipped with tools. And yes, they are cheaper and cheaper smartphones, but they still cost something. And that brings me to give you an example of also how needs evolve. With the conflict component by the pandemic, we've got a front line, which is also called the line of contact in Ukraine, where you've got point of passages. So civilians can cross, less and less civilians can cross. But with the pandemic, to cross into the government controlled areas, you need to install an app of surveillance, to say that, so that you can be traced, like those, COVID apps we've got in Europe. Or you have to go in self-isolation in a sanatorium where you have access to nothing, so you have people who actually do not cross or even attempt to cross the line, because their choice is either they are alone, isolated in a sanatorium with barely access to anything, or they need to have a smartphone that they can't afford, because the smartphone, no matter the cheapest smartphone, costs more than their monthly pension. So we also get to those, a lot of people come with social solution and social media as a solution. And it's a combination of both, because often it's not just an app, but it goes with social media. But the people don't have the means to go there. So a lot of work to be done on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that the needs are changing. And also you mentioned earlier that a big part of humanitarian aid in more developed countries is a big part of listening. And I can imagine that social media can also provide you insight in what kind of needs the local community has, right?
It is one element. It's not the only element, and it also has to be, first of all, you do have now I forgot the name. Those things that goes with not the motor, but sometimes you have fake social media. So that we also have to be careful, and we've seen that, and we see that very often, because we are quite visible in the social media in Ukraine, and sometimes we see like fake news developing through automated system. So you have to be extremely careful, but it does provide some information that then you have to also triangulate with face-to-face meetings, with direct phone contacts, with other tools. You cannot just rely on one, but it opens much more possibilities than before.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. One thing that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk was that you mentioned marketing and focus group, and obviously you're a CEMS alumna as well. What kind of business skills did you learn at the CEMS program and maybe at your early start at Procter & Gamble that you still use in your humanitarian work today?
I think primarily what I learned is, as I said, leadership and management, which those two elements is something I learned. A lot in my work environment, in Procter & Gamble, for instance, or in Hallmark, I learned a lot. But if I look back at risk analysis, I actually learned, quite a number of things more in the classroom, or in the dynamic classroom. One of my most marking CEMS classes was actually the exact title I forgot, but I would say International Financial Tools in ESADE, where we actually were simulating a market, and we were actually dealing with options, and at that time this was quite new. Since then it had become options and other financial tools, where we had actually to learn also about risk and how you manage risk. So, you know, its structure, the way you approach matters. And this is one of the courses I used immediately when I worked in the private sector. And actually, I was seen as an expert. I was like, well, I'm not an expert. I just had a course. And I was training other people in Procter & Gamble, so already at the time, because it was such a good course. We also, you know, is also looking at international strategy or, you know, and international logistics, which I did, you know, either more like academic learning, but we also had a lot of more practical exercise and studies. So this really helped shape an approach. Additionally to that, I would say, and today it's maybe less obvious, but still I think it's obvious, but it was very obvious at the time because it was the early stage of international studying. To work with people from very different backgrounds who have different approaches. And at that time, you should have seen the difference, well, in the way we studied, learned, and worked between even Cologne and HEC and ESADE, well, HEC and ESADE were maybe a bit closer. Our colleagues from St. Gallen had, again, another approach. So it was a diversity within Europe, but it was extremely diverse. And how you deal with that and how you're richer from that diversity because it brings more. Some of those differences might not be as concrete, you know, as exist prevalent today, you know, because the globalization of business study might also have changed. But it really helped open the mind and learn about diversity. There are many other things, you know, and some things sometimes we forget, but how you plan a project, how you plan a program, how, you know, all those elements, you know, I learned there. So there are many things, but there are still some of those courses that I really remember as, you know, I mean, as impacting me at the time in the first months of my, well, years of my professional life, really, and that helped me develop you know, certain skills or competencies over time. So it's but also, yeah, diversity, working with people who think differently, who work differently, who approaches differently. I think it's one of the biggest learning I had, but also true content. And
to see that. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
That's good to see that that things that you learned at CEMS are still relevant 30 years later. So that's provides me with a little hope for everything that I learn right now. So there are two questions that are related to your switch from the corporate world to the humanitarian world. So first of all, what triggered you to go there? And do you maybe have any advice for CEMSies that are looking to make that transition as well?
Basically, you know, I was at a point in my career where I was, you know, in a job where I was, well, I intended to leave, to be honest. And I had many other opportunities. So it was the right time, you know, when you've got the headhunters calling you, it's also the right time to say, okay, we take risk. And it was where I was. And I said, but I always wanted to do a humanitarian mission. So why not do one now? And initially, all this started by, I want to do a humanitarian mission on the model of, you know, what I knew when I was 20. So I thought about taking 6 months off, you know, possibly 12, but maximum, you know, it was just a short-term thing because I always wanted to do that. But what I knew from the humanitarian world dated from 10 years before. And 10 years before, you could not work in the humanitarian sector over the long term. I mean, it was extremely risky. There was no, it was not how it worked. And even when I joined at the time, I started as a volunteer. So it was not a volunteer where you have to pay for yourself, even though I had even made simulation on how I will, you know, I will have to pay. So I need to retain so much money to pay for my food and toothbrush and whatever, you know, like and when I started to apply, I discovered that I would be a volunteer, but that my accommodation would be paid, my food would be paid, and I would get, you know, the extraordinary amount of what would be about 600 euro per month, which was much, but at least, it was not going to cost me money, and I was, even with the organization I joined, I even had the social security and the pension. So you will start to look at things also differently. So, well, I joined that. And initially, it was ready for a year in my mind. It was not, it was for a year, but I always wanted to do that. And after a few months, it became obvious that it might be more than a year, because this is something I already was interested in. It was something I thought, where there was potential. And since the world had changed and allowed me to live, not to live from it, but to live, like to cover my needs, my basic needs, there was no reason why I could not continue. The thing is, I also actually applied as an administrator initially, and did one mission as an administrator, and the job was very similar to, I had a lot of similarities with what I was doing before, except that, instead of having a chief accountant and a whole team of accountants, instead of having, like an HR manager and a whole team, of having the whole structure, I had to do both the leadership, the management, and the job with some people, but that sometimes needed much more accompaniment, because it was in Sierra Leone, and we had, I forgot, it was close to 800 staff. Huh? I forgot it was 600 or 800 staff, but we had a huge team. Huh? So it was not a small. So I was like, the finance admin manager for that. So I with tools which were not adapted to such a size, to be honest. So it was a lot of makeshift tools still at the time. And then they actually, against my will, I was asked to move to operations and, to head of missions position and this type of things. And I learned more and more, and I liked it. So, and then you get, it's a job I love. I do it because I believe in what we do, but it's also a job and a life I love. So what advice to give? Well, first to know, I was just telling, Melissa and Jeroen and Leticia when we joined, I discovered, because of that event, that one of my colleagues who worked in Ukraine 2 years ago is actually a CEMS alumni, but much younger, I would say, than I am. And he told me, oh, by the way, I'm also CEMS. And so he started as an administrator. So on a field where you know more, like I would say it's administrator or HR management, or we also have logisticians that have an MBA background. So there you start by something you know more. If that's more for people who, I would say, who are more junior, so in their first 5 to 10 years career, starting on a field, and then you see if you can change to how you evolve in those organizations. Or there are people who come much later. There are people coming from the business world who come much later to the humanitarian sector, which sometimes I find a bit more challenging. So they might be a director of human resources, and in the private sector, and come as director of human resources in a big organization, or director of communication, marketing. I mean, we've seen such shift. It's a bit more difficult because for people who have never been in the field, it remains difficult to understand what it is about. And I think it's important to start in the field. The big challenge is, you have to be ready to get out of your comfort zone big time. And I say out of comfort, it's really out of your comfort zone. And that's something that has to be reflected before. You go into an environment you have no clue about, and once you're in there, you will regularly go to new contexts where you also discover new dynamics, or there are new developments. Nobody had foreseen the Islamic State. I can tell you, when the Islamic State started to be in place, that was a big shock. Even for those who had 20 years of humanitarian assistance. So you might be faced by, you change context a lot. You're in environments that are extremely difficult to understand. And the big issue, the biggest challenge is decision-making is very risky. When you work in the private sector, for most of the case, yes, you take the wrong decision, your company might lose a few million or a few hundred million, but it's money. In some cases, hundreds of people might lose their jobs. That starts to be more of a concern. But normally people don't lose their life. Neither your team, the risk is not that the team you're in charge of, or even worse, the people, well, I don't know what is worse, or the people you try to respond, whose need you cover, might lose their life if you take the wrong decision. This is tough. This is, and that's something that, people need to know that they will be faced with. And I got faced with it. I was still an administrator, but I was acting head of mission. And we really had to make tough decisions. And the question is that not that there is a good choice and a bad choice. There are a series of bad choices and you have to take the least worst. And I touched upon, one of those situations in the text I shared with you initially, but imagine you have to decide. So you have a population that is starving, and starving to the point that people are dying of starvation. So who are in an area which is extremely exposed to an armed groups that's surrounding them. If you don't give food to those people, they die of hunger. If you give food, they will be attacked, possibly killed and raped, so that their food gets, is captured by the armed group. How do you move out of that paradigm? How do you find the solution there? And those decisions are real. This is not everyday decision. This is not everyday decision in every context, but you regularly have situations where you have to make decisions on what you do. So you need to really be motivated, and you need, this is not for risk adverse people. Even though I work for what we call a risk adverse organization, the definition of risk, risk adversity and risk might be in a different world. So talk to people, read a lot, understand what you're facing. I actually, when I accepted my first position, I got the offer on a Friday. I went straight to the FNAC at the time. It was before, well, we had the internet, but not so much, and we didn't have, tablets and all those things. So I went to the FNAC. The FNAC was a big bookstore in Paris. And I bought 3 books that I read. I just spent 3 days reading those books. And one of those books was about testimonies of people who worked in the humanitarian sector. And it was really tough. Today, there are a lot of resources on the internet. There are lots of testimonies, movies. There is one which I think I unfortunately missed. I have to check if I can still do. MSF just issued also a movie. Listen and reflect whether it's a choice you want to make or not, because this is not for everyone. And it also has a cost for you. It has a cost for your family. It has a cost, for your friends. Some of my friends, including some of my CEMS friends, have spent very tough times. When I was in Iraq in 2003, they just wanted me out of there. And when I left, they told me, oh, what a relief. Well, today they got used, because now we are in 2021. But it has a cost, and you make people pay the cost, and people who are not part of the decision. So you need to be sure of what you do. Meanwhile, don't think my life is tough today. Sometimes it's tough, but I have a very nice life. I live in one of the most beautiful and exciting cities in the world. I have a fantastic apartment. I have a fantastic team. And yes, I go to, I cross front lines, and yes, I go to meet people, and sometimes there is shelling not too far. I hear it, but my team sometimes see it, and it could happen to me, that the bullets reach. And I'm under pressure. I'm under pressure of the parties to the conflict. I'm being challenged and criticized in the social media, or sometimes on the opposite, they say I do a good job, but you know, and it's very exposing. So there are a lot of risk with it, but for me it's worth it. But I weighted the pros and cons, and I'm not saying it did come at no cost for my family and friends. Definitely.
Yeah, I think like you said, a big part of if you want to join the humanitarian sector, it's because you have a deep passion to actually make a change. And I think if you feel that passion inside you, you just go for it, right? And another question that's maybe related to this is, how could you prepare to join the humanitarian sector? Is there, Rita asked the question, is business education the right education to work with NGOs? Is there anything that could prepare you to join that sector?
Well, it's all a matter. It all matters on. Well, it all depends on what you want to do too. Huh? I mean, in ICRC we have a huge number of lawyers, you know, because they studied international humanitarian law and they do a great job. But then they bring their legal aspects. We've got engineers, but well, those are actually more doing engineering work. But you know, we have heads of delegation today who did engineering studies and were water engineers or construction engineers. We have doctors and nurses, not as many as people would think, because we are not primary. I mean, health is just one of our responses, not our primary response, actually. I think a good education is the right education. You know, an education that teaches you to be curious, that challenge your mind and teaches you to have analytical skills, communication skills, to have leadership skills. This is what a good education is. Whether it's a business one or another one, I would say it doesn't matter. If this education gave you the right basis. And in many cases, when you see even in the business sector, after a while, you will see that it's not, you know, it's not so much the content of what you learned. I'm not talking about, you know, expert accountant or, you know, certain element, but a lot of what it's skills, and you need to have the right education. And I think, you know, as I said, I think the CEMS brought me a lot of what was needed for that. Not just the CEMS, other elements of my education, but the CEMS, some courses in the CEMS, and the way it was done, and helped me on that way. And also a lot of business schools and universities teaching business, or, you know, having business studies, are now increasingly looking at the social sector. And there are a lot that both sectors can learn from each other. They have been very skeptical from each other for a long time. I mean, when I joined the humanitarian sector, I mean, my first colleagues for the first 3 months were like, this one is not going to last. You know, she doesn't know what she does, or, you know, like, after 3 months, they started to change their mind. And well, today they know that I was there to last. But, you know, like, there is a good education is the right education. And it's not the field, it's the way you train your brain and adapt your brain and your heart and your body, and, you know, whatever.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I want to switch to another topic that Raphael mentioned, to get back on the pandemic situation. So there's a lot of talk about an upcoming recession and limited funding available. Like you said earlier, there's people focus more on their own country and their own response to the COVID situation, right? Do you how do you see the future of the INGOs and ICRC, which relates to the funding, right? How do you see that?
Luckily, you know, that's the job of my bosses in Geneva. No, I see it's a challenge. It's going to be a challenge, and but I also think it's, you know, I was talking a lot about influencing and responsible, you know, putting the responsibility where it should be. And I'll be very ICRC in my speech in that, but almost all the states in the world, well, almost all, I'm not sure, maybe one, I don't know, are state parties to the Geneva Convention. Okay, so they are signed to the, they have ratified the Geneva Convention. By ratifying the Geneva Convention, they accepted responsibilities, and they do have responsibilities. So that's one aspect already. So they do have to work and to strive to ensure that civilians and other categories of population that are vulnerable are protected and provided for in terms of conflict. So there is a commitment that goes beyond. Of course, the level of responsibility is different whether they are a direct party in the conflict, a support to that party, or a third party, but they all have a responsibility. That's one aspect. Then they have also to look at their own direct interest. If a country goes to hell and the population is in troubles, first they are accountable. They can be accountable in front of courts. People can leave that country and then become also a concern. This could create situations that also destabilize, the country, including in Europe. I mean, the conflict and the arrival of people. I mean, there are a lot of elements. So I think it's all about putting on the table their legal responsibilities, their moral responsibilities, but also, the fact that they expose themselves, their countries and their population in the longer term to other consequences if things are not done. And I think as WHO says and as we say, no one is safe until everybody is safe. And with the pandemic, this is really no one is safe until everybody is safe.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. We're nearing the end of this discussion. If there's anyone who wants to raise a question, please let me know. Before we go, Florence, do you have any final advice to the CEMSies or the CEMS alumni that are here, that are maybe do you want to share a big life lesson or something else? That we'll remember in 30 years. I remember 30 years ago, Florence made a brilliant speech.
What I would like to tell, I mean, we are all privileged. We are privileged to be CEMS alumni and students and to have come there. And we are privileged for many reasons. Sometimes because we had, supportive parents. Sometimes because we had, supportive teachers who brought us to that level of education. Supportive bankers for some, because you also need to pay. But in a nutshell, you're in a privileged situation that gives you the freedom to choose what you want to do. And I think you're free. We are free. And we have the means of this freedom thanks to the degrees we have and the education we got, possibly more than others, and just make the best of that freedom and do what you want to do. Because you all have this capacity. Because sometimes, I still hear people with a lot of education say, "Oh no, it's Monday again, and I have to go." Yeah, no. This doesn't go. And it can go for people who were not privileged enough, who had less choice. But you have the choice. Do what you love. Do what you like. Make a change. Make a difference. And it can be in many fields. And if your option is, maybe for some of you it's to bring more, services against money and to some people, why not? And you want, some of you might be, enter politics, do enter politics. I mean, you have this freedom, make the best of it because you are equipped for that.
Well, that was, I think, a very good life lesson for all of us. I think it's time that we're going to end this discussion. Maybe Melissa, you could pop up the slides.
We would like to give you a really warm thank you from all of the community. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. So bravo. And, thanks for all that you do. You make a really big difference. And we're happy that you have CEMS in your heart as well, which is great. Just a few things. So I'll leave the floor to Sharon.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. So yeah, as we said earlier, this is the start of the Global Alumni Week, and there are some few more events coming up. And the first one is going to be Alexi, that's going to talk about takeaways on how to achieve early startup growth, about his own enterprise MadPass and how you could further grow your early startup. And then another thing that I would like to mention is the CEMS Alumni podcast.
Yes, 1 second.
Right, Melissa.
There you go.
Thank you very much. It's a new podcast, and it explores the professional and personal journeys of CEMS alumni, such as Florence, and it's provided to you by the CEMS Alumni Association. Several experts from the startup scene, corporate sector, tech industry, consulting world, and other academia provide insights and share their path to success through practical and actionable tips. And the first episode will launch, let me see, March 10th, actually. So that's coming up very closely. So yeah, we hope to see all of you on the other great events in the Global Alumni Week. And afterwards, I believe you will receive also a survey via email that we hope you all fill out to provide us with great feedback on these sessions, how we can further improve these. Florence, thank you very much for being here again today. Everyone in the audience, thank you very much for being here and participating in the questions. It was very good to see all of you, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe and healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.